The White House is defending its exit from Afghanistan, but critics say it didn't have to be this ugly or precipitous. And Afghans who are left behind are warning of the worst that would happen to them if the U.S. doesn't ensure their safe exit. To discuss what went wrong, what the U.S. can do now, and what this means for America's standing in the world, I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Paul Miller, who is a former veteran. He served in Afghanistan, worked for the CIA on the National Security Council staff under both Bush and Obama, and he's author of Just War and Ordered Liberty. Paul, thank you so much for your time.
Jessica, thanks so much for inviting me on the show.
I want to start just by asking for your reaction. President Biden just spoke to the nation. What are your thoughts after hearing his words?
Well, President Biden's speech, 10 or 15-minute speech, hit all the notes I expected from him. He avoided responsibility for what's happened in Afghanistan the past few days. He mostly shifted blame onto the Afghans themselves. He claims that the outcome was inevitable, that it was unavoidable. There was no way we could have avoided this sooner or later. He said that we had accomplished our main mission by getting Osama bin Laden, and claiming, falsely I think, that Al-Qaeda has been severely degraded, and on and on and on. I could go on about the number of myths that he spun during his speech. So I'm not a fan of that speech. I also noted that the tone of the speech, he was quite defiant, and I am feeling quite a lot of grief and sorrow these past few days, and I sort of expected that he might try to channel some of that and show some empathy for the difficulty that many American veterans are going through, and of course, much more so, the difficulty that the Afghans are now going through. And I didn't hear almost any of that in the speech, just one very brief passage in there. So it did not go over well with me, I'll say that.
And Biden is a president who's known for expressing empathy and compassion for the human condition, the human plight. So it is a noteworthy absence in his comments. I want to get into some of your critique, but before we do, I just want to acknowledge you are a vet. You said this is hitting you personally. You're looking at these photos, you know the fear that so many who worry they'll be left behind are expressing. What goes through your mind as these moments unfold?
Well, it feels like an abandonment of our allies and a betrayal of the cause that we served for. And it feels like it cheapens the hardship, the sacrifice, and the loss of those who served in Afghanistan, particularly for those who were wounded or killed. So that's how it feels. And, yesterday, today's Monday, yesterday, I had to take a day, a fast, a Sabbath away from the media and away from Twitter because I just couldn't compose myself. That's how difficult it's been. And again, I don't want to make this all about me. It's so much harder for those who are actually living through this downrange, but it does hit pretty hard for me.
You've argued in your most recent piece that this rapid collapse of the Afghan National Army wasn't inevitable. Now, the president suggested that it was. The White House thought they had a month or months before the Taliban would take over Afghanistan, not mere days. But they say it was an inevitability. You argue that's not the case. Why?
So the president is appealing to a version of history, a kind of a mythological version of history that says, we've been fighting a war for 20 years. We've been building the Afghan army for 20 years. If they're not ready by now, they never will. So I think it's worthwhile to revisit some of the history so that people understand more accurately what has and has not happened. In 2001, there was no Afghan army. The Afghan army that exists today is much better than it used to be because, in the first place, it actually exists. The Afghan army that exists today, I should say not today, as of 2 days ago, really, was better than it was in 2006 or 7. The first 5 or 6 years of the effort, it was not the United States. We had not signed up. It was the Germans, the British, and the United Nations that volunteered to lead efforts to train the Afghan army and police security forces. And they wasted 6 years doing almost nothing. They never recognized the scale of the problem. And after 5 or 6 years, they had something like, only 10,000 troops actually trained. So the United States did move in to assume leadership of that effort when it was already 6 or 7 years into our intervention, and the insurgency had already started. And we had managed to cobble together a pretty large force within a couple of years, because Presidents Bush and Obama dumped a lot of money on the Afghan forces 2007, 8, 9, 10. And so for the last decade, that Afghan force, having just been called into existence, threw itself in the fight, held the Taliban at bay, lost 50,000 troops in action against the Taliban, despite what the president says is their unwillingness to fight. They fought for 10 years side by side with us. And then at the very end, this spring, the president said, even though we know you're not ready, we're leaving. The U.S. Department of Defense reported truthfully, and report after report, they always said the Afghan army is making progress. They're not ready for completely independent operations yet. It was a true statement, and they made it in every report. And the president said, I don't care that they're not ready, we're leaving. So the fact that the Afghan soldiers heard the president's message, they made an individually rational decision that if they weren't going to have the resources they needed to fight, they wouldn't fight. They would save their lives and go home. And that was an individually rational decision when we told them we were going to pull away all of the resources we'd given them. They wouldn't have what they needed to fight. And so the logical conclusion is that the Afghan army collapses. That's the true story of what happened. If we had stayed and given them what they needed, they could have stayed in the field. They could have carried on the fight against the Taliban. And we had been making incremental progress, building a better security force. I think to say that it was inevitable they would collapse, that it was impossible to build anything, it's transparently an effort to excuse ourselves of responsibility for what's happened. We're the most powerful nation in the world, the most powerful nation in world history. Of course, we could have done differently.
Some of this started under President Trump, did it not? You've written about removing air power from the Afghan army, and then President Trump negotiated this departure that the current administration sort of accepted and continued the policy on. Would you speak a little bit about what came before this moment, and were there key points where we abandoned our allies in the army?
There's blame enough to go around everywhere. The seeds for this were sown a long time ago. So as critical as I've just been of President Biden, you're absolutely right that every commander-in-chief that has overseen this effort has made their fair share of mistakes. I would point to 3 previous specific mistakes. One was President Bush's decision to go in with a light footprint when Afghanistan actually needed a larger investment of resources. The second mistake was President Obama's decision in 2009 and 10 to announce his intent to withdraw troops even as he was sending them in. And so much of what President Obama ended up doing, whatever resources we invested were sort of wasted because the enemy understood they could simply wait us out since Obama announced when we were leaving. And the third mistake was, yes, President Trump's decision to sign a peace deal with the Taliban, which we now understand was essentially a surrender deal, not a peace deal. Those are 3 mistakes that the United States made leading up to this point. And so President Biden was dealt a tough hand, but he played it incredibly badly. That's my best, most fair assessment of President Biden's decision-making I can give you. You had asked about the air support and things like that. Early on in Trump's term, his first speech on Afghanistan in August 2017, he said, he threw out Obama's timetables. He said, we're going to win this war. I'm going to loosen up the rules of engagement, and we're really going to go after the enemy. But he also said, we're not doing nation building. What that meant was in 2017, 18, and a bit into 19, we had a more kinetic war. We were dropping more bombs, a lot more bombs, in the effort to drive the Taliban to the negotiating table. But we did almost nothing for reconstruction and stabilization. That's not a recipe for victory. And what it did lead to was the agreement that Trump signed. So in 2019 and 20, that's when we began to pull back some of those military support that the Afghans needed leading up to the negotiations.
The president and the White House broadly have said that the U.S. really had only 2 options. One was to stay in Afghanistan and participate in fighting their civil war, which would have required committing more troops to the country, which the president said he was flatly unwilling to do, or withdraw. there's also the option of maintaining that small presence we had indefinitely. Would you have been in favor of staying there with no exit?
So there's another myth here that wars are fought on timetables. When we got into World War II, it was indefinite. It was open-ended. There was no timetable there. There was no withdrawal. We didn't tell Hitler or Tojo, we're going to, after D-Day, we're leaving in 3 months. Like, we didn't say that. So this whole idea of setting timetables on wars is kind of weird to me. And so when, I'm trying to flip the script here, you're asking me, do I want to go in indefinitely? And what I'm saying is, do you want to go in with a timetable? That's not really how wars are supposed to be fought. I'm not aware of a single strategist, a single military field manual, a single text on military affairs that says you should adopt timetables in warfare. This is not how wars fought. As they say, the enemy gets a vote. All plans never survive the first shot being fired. So I'm in favor of fighting wars intelligently, which means not trying to fight them on some kind of artificial timeline.
The president also said that it's not in our national security interest to stay. How is our national security impacted by this exit?
So we originally intervened in Afghanistan to fight al-Qaeda because they had attacked us on 9/11, and to fight al-Qaeda's enablers, which is the Taliban, and al-Qaeda's copycats and fellow travelers. It's a whole menagerie of other jihadist groups. We killed bin Laden. We killed a number of other senior leaders. We put them on the run. And we actually successfully kept most of them in hiding because they were too busy, hiding from us, from our airstrikes, from our drones, from our special forces, that they were not able to plan and carry out other large-scale terrorist attacks for the last 20 years. That's a success we shouldn't lose sight of. But al-Qaeda does still exist. Other jihadist groups still exist. Other jihadist groups have come to exist, like the Islamic State. And the Taliban is ideologically still aligned with them. So is our national security safer or less safe now that the Taliban controls an entire country, and now that al-Qaeda, which still exists, is able to operate and travel with impunity across the Afghanistan and Pakistan area? Now that they can, now they're no longer busy running and hiding from our airstrikes. They have the time to recruit, train, fundraise, and plan future terrorist attacks. Do you think we're safer or not as safe as before? I think we're not as safe. I think our national security has been imperiled by the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. We are, the political situation, the international security situation is as it was on September 10th, 2001. Now, I don't want to be a chicken little here. Our homeland security is better than it was. It's absolutely much better than it was. So we are a little safer in that respect. Our defense is better, but the world situation is worse than it was in September 2001.
I can hear the emotion in your voice. You said it's partly sadness for the people who are there and worried, but there's also the amount of time and hours of lives lost, treasure spent on Afghanistan over 2 decades. Would you help us understand what this must feel like to veterans who've spent years serving there, who must wonder, what was it for?
I think that many veterans feel as if it was worthless. Speaking for myself, I really wonder what it was for. The meaning of a thing often becomes only apparent in how it ends. And right now, seeing how it has ended, it makes me wonder, why did I spend all those years of my life working on this? The friends I lost in Afghanistan, why? What did it accomplish? That's why it's helpful for me to remember, hey, we've had 20 years with no major terrorist attack emanating from Afghanistan. That is a good thing that we should not take for granted. And one other very small silver lining I want to take from this, and perhaps this will be a help to any veterans out there listening. The last 20 years has given the new generation of Afghans a taste of something different. If someday we get to the end of the Taliban, if someday 50 years from now Afghanistan is a democracy, I think it will be because some of the Afghans who lived through these 20 years took inspiration from it. And they used it to work to make their country better in the far distant future. It's out of our hands now, but perhaps we have given them something to remember and I hope to take inspiration from. It's a very small comfort, but I hope that could be a meaningful thing we can hold on to.
Based on what you understand, do you think Afghans have the capacity to resist the Taliban?
It's no longer about capacity, it is about will. What's remarkable to me is the last week has involved almost no fighting. It's not been a violent takeover. What the Taliban did is actually the same thing they did in 1995, 1996 when they first took over the country. They did not take over through conquest. In the 90s, they took over through bribery, intimidation, and cutting deals. They went to a local warlord or commander and said, look, we don't want to kill you. We'll hire you. We'll make you in charge of this district as long as you pledge fealty to us. And they were able to sweep through half the country that way in the 90s. It didn't work outside of Pashtun areas. What's remarkable is this time around, it did work outside of Pashtun areas. They walked into Herat, which is not a Pashtun area, and they did the same thing. They bought off Ismail Khan, who's a Tajik warlord. I was very surprised to see that. And so it seems to me that the Afghans do not have the will. As I said before, the soldiers in the Afghan army made the rational calculation that they did not have the tools they needed to win this fight. And so they chose not to fight. I would be very surprised to see any meaningful anti-Taliban insurgency pop up in the immediate future. Perhaps in the longer run, but right now, as the dust is settling, it seems to be remarkably stable in the Taliban's favor.
I'm seeing interviews with Afghans, especially women, who are flatly panicked. And they say, if I don't leave, I will die. I will be killed. How important is it that the US stay for as long as it takes to get out everybody who might be in danger? Is that even possible? The deadline for withdrawal was August 31st. Would you like to see the US stay longer if more people need evacuation?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to make sure the listeners hear this. You said interviews with Afghan women. It's beyond, it's Afghan women, it's human rights activists. It is the Afghan soldiers, especially special forces and pilots with high capacity training from the US. It is religious minorities and dissidents who are being targeted. I've seen now anecdotal reporting and private messages suggesting the Taliban are going door to door and finding these people and executing them.
Already.
So I want people to be aware that that is a consequence of the decision our government's made. So how afraid should people be? Yeah, they should be pretty afraid. How long should we stay? I'd like to say as long as possible, but let's be honest about it. Right now, we have a couple of thousand American troops at Kabul International Airport, rather rapidly, almost frantically trying to get out American civilians and diplomats as fast as possible, and then get out the special immigrant visa program applicants as fast as possible. And there's something like 12,000 of them. And then after that will be just simple refugees, people who want to flee the country. Yes, I would like to see us stay as long as possible. Is that realistic? I'm not sure it is. I'm not even sure we're going to get out all the SIV applicants. I hope we do. It might be cheaper in the long run to stay and defeat the Taliban than to welcome as refugees all the Afghans who want to flee the Taliban's terror. That would be my preferred choice, is eliminate the condition that led to the refugee crisis in the first place. That would be a lot easier than trying to stay and frantically evacuate tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Afghans who want to flee the Taliban,
Would you speak to the safety and security of the people who are still there, including Americans who are likely in Kabul, but not yet at the airport?
Hard for me to do that on the other side of the world. My own ability to kind of understand what's going on hour by hour is limited to what I see in the media. If I was over there right now, I'd make sure to get myself to the airport as quickly as possible. It does not seem to me to be a safe situation for anybody.
And what about the journalists who are in Kabul reporting?
Also, I expect quite dangerous. The Taliban in the 1990s were not friendly to international journalists. Afghanistan was essentially a closed country, about as closed as North Korea, except that the Taliban government was simply less capable than North Korea in enforcing its terror. And I'll say this, the Taliban has improved in its media savvy. They know how to work the international media in a way they didn't 30 years ago. So they might wait a little bit before reimposing the full measure of their brutality, because they know right now they are under the international spotlight. There's a lot of journalists still paying attention, more than just 3 weeks ago, because of all the high profile events. And so it may be that the Taliban actually wait. And it may be 6 months from now that we really see the reversion to the 1990s norm.
That's what one of my national security sources said. They'll wait until a month until we're out of the news cycle before they start mass executions.
I think that's exactly right. That said, as I said, I do think it's going on right now. They're probably prioritizing the high profile, the Afghan special forces, the people who could fight back, the people who could start an anti-Taliban insurgency. They're hunting them down. They're executing them now. And then we might see a larger wave of reprisal killings later on.
They say that they're sort of the kinder, gentler Taliban. There's no chance that's true.
I don't believe there is. In 30 years of their existence, they've not really changed their ideology, their theology. We gave them 20 years to denounce al-Qaeda, and they never did. Year after year, they made a conscious decision not to denounce al-Qaeda, never to recognize al-Qaeda's responsibility for the terrorist attacks of 2001, never to promise to take proactive action against al-Qaeda. They could have ended the war if they had just done that. They could have ended the war years ago, and they chose not to, and instead aim for military victory.
Does this empower Iran in the region, or is its history with the Taliban so complicated? Not necessarily.
I think not necessarily. The Taliban and Iran nearly went to war in 1998 over the killing of some diplomats. They are quite different. They're the Sunni and the Shia versions of sort of jihadism, but they take that difference very seriously. There was a season during the U.S. war in Afghanistan when Iran maybe was a bit warmer towards the Taliban. But now that we are out of the picture, Taliban's back in control, you may see some tensions again between Iran and the Taliban. I think if there's anybody that gains out of this, it's certainly Pakistan. Pakistan gains influence. Perhaps China as well. I think that they see an opportunity to benefit economically from this and to wrap Afghanistan into their Silk Road program. We'll see. I'm not sure.
Do you think we're at greater danger of domestic terror attacks going forward?
So we talked about international terrorism, and I think we are certainly at a higher risk of international terrorism today than previously. Do you mean by lone wolf attacks?
No. I mean that we went into Afghanistan ostensibly to fight them there so we don't have to fight them here to degrade al-Qaeda, et cetera. But if the Taliban is back in power, you can see a resurgence, presumably, as you're saying, of various militant groups. If they have a base to operate from, does that pose a danger to the U.S. homeland in time?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And that's the whole reason why we should not have left and why we should have stayed, because we are now at heightened risk of terrorist attacks emanating from that region. As I said, our homeland security is better. We're better at defense. That's a good thing. So I'm not trying to hype a threat, but I do want to say that the international environment, because of the safe haven that al-Qaeda now has and its copycats, we are now at heightened risk. I don't want to say we collectively, it's the whole world. Look, al-Qaeda and ISIS, they attack the European allies. They've attacked Russia. They attack across the Middle East. They're an enemy of human civilization. We were leading a coalition of dozens of nations against them, and we lost. And so, yes, all of us are now at heightened risk of terrorist attack.
Paul, I think of this administration as a group of people who are pretty well versed in international policy, global history, a lot of foreign policy hands with significant experience. There are plenty of people warning that the Taliban would rout the Afghan army much faster than months from now. What went wrong? How did they so miscalculate?
First, my understanding is that the decision-making within the Biden administration perhaps was not unanimous, and that there maybe was some internal dissent. And at the end of the day, this was Biden's decision, that he went, again, this is somewhat anecdotal, but my understanding is he did actually went against the advice of some of his advisors and certainly his military advisors. So we may find later on when the history books are written that some of the Biden administration completely recognized how this could go wrong and told the president, and he made the decision anyway. Okay, so that's one response. Another response is, I'm actually not sure anybody predicted the speed with which this all happened over the past week. We all knew that the Afghan army and government could collapse if we withdrew too soon, which is exactly what we did. And I wrote that 5, 6, 7 times over the years. Like every other article I'd write, I'd say that. And it's not just me. There's many people who understood that reality. President Biden, again, just gave his speech, and he explained what he believes. He believed this was going to happen sooner or later, and so we had better minimize our costs and just do it now, kind of rip off the Band-Aid, so we're not sacrificing any more of our people, right? That's what he genuinely believes. I noted that in his speech, he made 2 or 3 references to Vietnam. It's very clear to me that he sees the war in Afghanistan through the prism of Vietnam. He's of the generation, it was his first term in the Senate. He was 29 years old, I think, when Saigon fell. And he's of the generation that believed that Vietnam was lost from the beginning, a doomed war that was impossible to win, and that it was good to get out as fast as possible. And the fall of Saigon proves all that. And it's clear to me, when you look back at Biden's involvement in the Afghan war, dating back to his days as vice president under President Obama, he's always believed that. And he's believed that for at least since 2009, if not earlier. And I think he's been wrong that whole time. I think Afghanistan is its own war, and it is wrong to analogize it to Vietnam too much, except in how it's ended. It certainly seems a lot like Vietnam. And that's because Biden has made it so. And so his use of that historical analogy has really distorted his thinking, where he sees Kabul and he thinks Saigon, and he's thought that, for 10 years, long before the actual fall of Kabul.
You're a professor, you read history, you teach. How do you think this moment will be remembered by history?
The first draft of history is rightly putting a lot of blame on President Biden for this decision. Even the people who supported a withdrawal are criticizing the president for how it went about, how chaotic and messy it's been, and for our abandonment of our allies and our failure to plan better for the SIV applicants. And I hope that history tells that story forever, because I think it's a true story. We also need to recognize, as I said before, that our failures are many, and they started a long time ago. There's blame enough to go around, and I listed off the ways I think each of the prior administrations got it wrong. And so history should account that we made years of mistakes. As I used to joke, we've never missed an opportunity to make a mistake in Afghanistan. And I used to say the one mistake we didn't make was leaving, because so long as we didn't make that mistake, we could actually correct the other ones. But this was the one mistake we can't undo. History, I think, should record that this is it's a disgrace, it's a dishonor, it's a avoidable harm done to America's national security and our honor. And that's how I think of it, and that's how I think history will remember it.
Those are brutal words, and yet so many feel them today. Thank you so much for your service and for your work and your time today.
Thank you for giving me a chance to share some of these thoughts. I know it's grim, and I sometimes feel like I have to apologize for being such a downer, but hard not to be.
Challenging moment. Thank you.